That June, the Wind River wasn't just a body of water. It was a living, breathing monster. It roared through the high country with a violence that sounded like rolling thunder, chewing up the banks and spitting out whole trees. It was mean, unpredictable, and loud enough to drown out a man's thoughts. Eli Walker stood by his corral, the rhythmic rasp of a metal file against a horseshoe, the only order in a chaotic afternoon. He was a man who kept to himself, comfortable with silence and hard work. But then, a sound cut through the deafening roar of the water. It wasn't the screech of a hawk or the cry of a mountain cat sounds he knew, as well as his own heartbeat. This was different. It was thin, sharp, and terrifyingly human. He dropped the file in the dirt and ran Dot when he reached the bank. The river was a churning nightmare of brown water and white foam. It was tearing at the earth, dragging broken branches and debris downstream. And then he saw her, a dark shape tangled in the skeletal remains of a fallen cottonwood tree. A woman. Her face was pale, turned up toward the gray sky, one arm hooked, desperately around a slick limb, while the current pulled at her, trying to rip her away. Eli didn't hesitate. He shoved his boots off, unbuckled his gun belt, and threw it aside. The moment he hit the water, the cold punched the breath right out of him. It was the kind of cold that seizes your muscles, but Eli fought through it. Logs bumped against his ribs, and the river grit ground between his teeth. He swam with the desperation of a man who knows the choice is simple. Get to her, or watch her die. Dot. He reached the tree, bracing himself against a thick branch, and grabbed her arm. Her skin felt like ice. Her head rolled back limp. She was trapped, something pinning her leg beneath the surface. Eli took a deep breath, submerged himself into the dark, murky pool of the river, and worked blindly. Wood scraped his knuckles, raw, and his lungs burned for air, but finally the snag gave way. He surged up, gasping, hauling her with him. He kicked for the shore until his legs were trembling, collapsing onto the muddy bank in a heap of wet cloth and riverweed. For a long moment, there was nothing but the roar of the water and the pounding of his own heart in his ears. Then she coughed, harsh, racking coughs that expelled dirty river water. Her eyes fluttered open moss green, hazy with pain and terrified confusion. "You're safe," Eli said, his voice rough from the cold and the adrenaline. "You're on my land near the Wind River." She tried to push herself up, but her strength was gone. Her dark dress clung to her frame like a second skin, heavy and soaking. She crossed her arms over her chest, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. "You need a fire," he told her, the practical part of his mind taking over. "My cabin is close." Panic flashed in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, pulling away from him. "Do not take me to town." Eli held her gaze, seeing a fear there that went deeper than just the river. "I'm not taking you to town," he promised, "but you'll freeze to death out here." She searched his face, looking for a lie, as if misjudging him would cost her everything. Finally, she gave a small, jerky nod. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled immediately. Eli caught her, lifting her into his arms. She was shockingly light, frail as a scarecrow caught in a storm. A soaked leather satchel, still tied securely to her wrist, bumped against his arm as he walked. He shouldered the door of his cabin open, carrying her out of the wind and into the sanctuary of his home. It was a small, plain room, a stone fireplace, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table, and shelves lined with the basics: coffee, beans, and a few well-worn books. The air smelled of wood smoke and quiet, a stark contrast to the violence outside. "Get those wet things off," he said, turning his back to her to give her a semblance of privacy as he knelt to feed the fire. It sounded like an order, but it was just survival. He set a pot of coffee to boil and poured a shot of whiskey into 2 tin cups, placing one within her reach. When he finally turned back, she was wrapped in his spare wool blanket, her dress and underthings hanging over a chair. To steam dry, a purple bruise was beginning to darken on her cheek, standing out against her pale skin. Her hair lay in wet, heavy ropes over her shoulders. She held the cup with both hands, clutching it like a lifeline, as if the heat could warm her bones from the inside out. "My name is Eli Walker," he said. It felt strange to speak his own name aloud in this solitary place. "Clara Jensen," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. They drank in silence, the fire snapping and popping in the hearth. A log shifted with a sound like a gunshot, and Clara flinched violently. Eli watched her, realizing then what true fear looks like when it's carved into a person's soul. He set a tin plate of bacon and beans in front of her. At first she shook her head, but hunger eventually won out, and she ate slowly, carefully. "The river won't drop by morning," Eli said, watching the window. "You're stuck here a spell." Her shoulders sagged, the adrenaline fading to leave only exhaustion. The pride she had been holding on to fell away, revealing a worn-out soul. A single tear cut a clean line through the dirt on her cheek. "My husband died," she said, staring into the flames. "He gambled. He left debts. The men who came, they said our place was theirs. I rode at night to get away. I didn't know the river would be like that." Eli stood at the window, looking out at the unmoving pines on the ridge. He didn't need names. He knew the type of men she was talking about. He had seen their work before. "Eat," he said gently. "You'll need your strength." When night finally fell, the silence of the cabin felt heavier than usual. Eli laid his bedroll out on the rough floorboards near the hearth, leaving the narrow cot for her. He stretched out, clasping his hands behind his head, staring up. The shadowed ceiling beams. The fire had died down to glowing coals, casting a faint, warm light across the room. He tried to sleep, but the room felt different now. He could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing, could feel her presence in the small space, like a new scent on the wind, something impossible to ignore. A rustle of fabric broke the stillness. Soft footsteps approached him and hesitated. "Mr. Walker," she whispered into the dark. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the embers. "Your shirt," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The blue one from the war ... Is it clean?" Eli frowned. He kept that old Union tunic folded in a cedar chest. The blue wool had faded to a pale gray years ago. He hadn't worn it since he mustered out, and he wasn't sure why he still kept it. "It is," he answered. Silence stretched out again, thick and uncomfortable. He could hear the wind whistling under the doorframe. When she spoke next, her voice was so small and raw it barely carried across the room. "Do you want to look at me?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He didn't turn. He didn't move a muscle. She rushed on, the words spilling out as if she were afraid the silence would swallow her whole. "Will you stay if I undress?" Eli didn't hear a seduction. He heard a transaction. He heard the years of shame and trade, the brutal lesson the world had taught her, that help always came with a price, and that price was her body. Heat flared in his chest, not desire, but a sharp, burning anger. He was angry at her sorrow, and furious at the kind of men who had made her believe this was all she was worth. He turned his head just enough to see her silhouette against the faint firelight. She was standing there, clutching the blanket tight, shaking like a leaf in a storm. He looked at her for a moment, then turned his back to the fire, staring hard into the coals. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice low and firm. "No one is going to bother you here. Not tonight. Not ever." For a long time, nothing moved. Then, the ropes of the cot creaked as she sat down. A soft, stifled sound escaped into the darkness, a sob she couldn't hide. Eli lay stiff on the floor, listening to the river rushing outside and her quiet weeping inside. He felt something he had locked up tight for years begin to crack down the middle dawn, painted the mountains in pale light. Eli was already up, the coffee pot boiling on the stove. Clara rose late, favoring her injured leg. She kept the blanket wrapped tight around herself until she ducked behind a hanging cloth to dress. When she finally stepped out, she couldn't meet his eyes. The shame of the previous night hung over her like a heavy winter coat. "The river is still high," Eli said from the doorway, looking out. "You're safe here until it drops." "I see," she replied quietly. And so they fell into a hard, simple rhythm. It was a quiet existence. She took over the garden, weeding the rows, with careful, deliberate hands, and hauled water from the creek. He chopped firewood and rode the fence line. They spoke very little, but they observed. He watched the way her hands moved, neat and sure, and how she startled at any sharp sound. She watched him too, learning the shape of his solitude. They were two wounded animals, caught by the high water, sharing the same small fire, waiting for the danger to pass. On the fourth morning, the peace was broken. A rider appeared on the ridgeline. It was Jed, a hand from the main ranch, easily spotting them from his tall bay horse. Clara froze in the doorway, the color draining from her face instantly. "Who is that?" "Just a ranch hand," Eli assured her. "He won't bother you." Jed rode down to the corral and tipped his hat, but his eyes drifted past Eli, fixing on Clara with a look that was both curious and sharp. "Walker," Jed nodded. "Boss wanted to know if you needed supplies. Crossing at Flat Rock is passable now if a man is careful." He leaned down from his saddle, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Town's buzzing, though. Folks are doing a lot of talking about the widow Jensen." Clara flinched as if he'd struck her. Eli's jaw set hard. "What are they saying?" "They say Silas died over cards," Jed said, shifting uneasily. "Say he owed hard men. The land is gone. Sheriff put a notice on the claim, and creditors are looking for assets. Some folks are calling her trouble." Clara stepped back into the shadows of the cabin, disappearing from view. When Jed finally rode off, the silence he left behind felt heavy and mean. "He was right," she said, her voice hollow as she stared at the hearth. She stood in the center of the cabin, looking smaller than ever. "Silas died in a fight. He drank. He left debts I couldn't pay. And the claim, it was never really mine. Our marriage was a trail wedding. No papers were ever filed. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't a wife. I was just a woman living in his house." Her voice thinned, threatening to break. "I had to leave." Eli leaned against the doorframe, looking out at the hard, unforgiving blue sky. "Promises are just words men break," he said quietly. "I know it." He turned to her then, and for the first time, he offered her a piece of his own past. He told her about his brother, Samuel 17, bold and full of life, who had enlisted after him and died in a muddy camp before ever firing a shot. He told her about Eleanor, the woman he had intended to marry, who had wed a merchant while Eli was still marching through the mud of the South. "I came home to graves and a closed door," he said, the old pain surfacing in his voice. "Since then, I keep to myself." That night, a bitter north wind rattled the eaves of the cabin. Clara grew hot and glassy-eyed. By midnight, she was shaking violently with fever. Eli sat by the cot, dipping a rag into a basin of cool water and pressing it to her forehead, her wrists, her throat. The firelight threw long, dancing shadows up the log walls, watching over them. Near dawn, her eyes finally cleared. She looked up at him, felt his rough hand on her brow, and reached up to grip it weakly. "You are the only one who has touched me without wanting something," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. Then she slid back into a rough slumber. The words cut him deep and true. He stayed in his chair until the fever broke with the morning light. When she woke, the river had dropped, its roar softening to a lower growl. She emerged from behind the curtain, wearing his old faded army shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her bare legs damp from walking in the morning grass. The fever had washed away, leaving her looking clean and new. She stood by the Wind River and met his eyes. "Can I stay a little longer?" she asked. There was no fear in the question this time, only a small, brave hope. He nodded once. The crossing is still bad for a few days, he reasoned, though they both knew the river was passable. "You can work for your keep. I don't run a charity." And so a new rhythm began. She baked bread, the smell filling the small cabin. She tended the garden, coaxing life from the soil, and mended his torn shirts with neat, tiny stitches. He cut fence posts, checked the cattle, and split wood for the fire. They were learning each other in small, silent ways. He started leaving, a fresh bucket of water by the door for her each morning. She began setting a hot cup of coffee on the hearth for him every noon. They spoke little, but the quiet between them had turned warm. On a bright afternoon, Clara took Eli's buckskin horse, Drum, for a ride along the river flats. Her hair was loose, catching in the wind. Suddenly, the earth beneath them crumbled, sending horse and rider sliding down a shallow ravine. Drum spooked, tearing free and scrambling up the bank. Eli heard her cry out and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He found her sitting in the dust at the bottom of the ravine, shaken but whole. He scrambled down and hauled her up by the shoulders, his hands moving frantically over her arms and back, checking for broken bones. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice tight with panic. She shook her head, trembling. "I'm okay." Relief hit him like a physical blow. Without thinking, he pulled her tight against his chest and held on. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the hammer of her pulse against his and the feel of her breath on his shirt. He tipped her chin up, looking into her eyes, and almost kissed her. Then he saw the old flicker of duty in her eyes, the echo of that first night's bargain. She was ready to pay him for his rescue. He stopped. He let her go abruptly, turning away to calm the horse with unsteady hands. They walked back to the cabin in silence. That night, the air in the room was thick with things unsaid. After supper, she stood in the firelight, still wearing his old blue shirt. Her fingers went to the buttons, slow and sure. The shirt slipped from her shoulders and fell to the floor in a puddle of blue wool. She stood there in her thin cotton shift, the scars on her back pale as threads in the flickering light. "Will you stay this time?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. Eli stepped toward her. He reached out and cupped her face in his rough hands. Desire rose in him like a tide strong, clean and undeniable. "I want you," he said, his voice raw and honest. "But not because you think you owe me." Her whole body shook. Tears fell soundless down her cheeks. The dam broke, and the words spilled out torn and true. She told him about the Kansas drought. That took her family. About being a hungry girl who took what she could to survive. About a life with Silas that was nothing but bruises and fear. He held her through it all, and then he told her what he knew from the war. "That doesn't make you less," he whispered into her hair. "It makes you brave." 2 days later, the peace was shattered. It started as a smudge on the horizon, then resolved into a rider pushing his mount hard. Jed arrived with dust oiling in his wake, his horse's sides heaving as he pulled up near the corral. "Walker," he gasped, not bothering to dismount. "There's a man in Lander asking questions. Amos Jensen, Silas's brother." Clara went rigid. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost in the bright afternoon sun. "He says she ran with his money," Jed continued, glancing sympathetically at Clara before turning back to Eli. "Claims she took a strong box full of silver. He's riling up a crowd at the saloon, and the sheriff is listening. They're talking about a posse." Eli didn't look at Jed. He looked at Clara. She was trembling, caught in the grip of a nightmare that refused to end. "We go speak for ourselves," Eli said, his voice cutting through the panic. "We won't hide like criminals." He saddled Drum and a gentle mare for Clara. They rode out within the hour, leaving the sanctuary of the cabin behind. The ride to Lander was tense, the silence between them filled with the drumming of hooves and the weight of what awaited them. Sheriff. Brody's office was a cramped room that smelled of stale tobacco smoke, sweat, and old paper. Brody sat behind his desk, a man thick through the middle who clearly enjoyed the weight of the badge pinned to his chest. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing. "Your brother-in-law has quite a story," Brody said, leaning back in his chair. "Says you stole a strongbox. 2 men are ready to swear they saw you take it." "There was no strongbox," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "My husband left nothing but gambling debts and bruises. I left with my life, Sheriff. That is all I took." Brody looked her over with a lazy, insulting smirk, dismissing her words before they even landed. He turned his gaze to Eli. "I know you, Walker," he said. "Quiet man. Keep to yourself upriver. Best stay that way. This woman? She's trouble wrapped in a skirt. You'd do best to turn her in and let the court sort it out." Eli looked at the sheriff and saw something he recognized from the war. It was the old blind certainty of men in power, the kind of arrogance that sent boys to die in muddy fields without a second thought. He realized then that the truth didn't matter in this room. He took Clara's arm firmly. "We're leaving. If you walk out that door, Walker, you're aiding a fugitive," Brody called out lazily. Not bothering to stand out, Eli ignored him, guiding Clara out into the bright, harsh sunlight of the street. "We can't go back to the cabin," he told her, keeping his voice low. "If they come, they'll come there first. We ride south and think." They rode until the sun dipped below the horizon, finding shelter in the skeleton of a broken barn on the open plain. The wind whistled through the gaps in the rotting wood. In the darkness, Clara's strength finally snapped. The weight of the accusation, the fear of Imlas, the injustice of it all, it was too much. She sank onto a pile of old hay and wept like a storm breaking. Eli let her cry. When the sobs finally quieted to ragged breaths, she wiped her face and looked at him. "The scars on my back. Silas gave them to me," she whispered. "And the winter my baby died. It wasn't the cold. It was him." She took a shuddering breath. "There was no strongbox. I had a small canvas bag, just a few coins. I had hidden away over the years. Egg money, washing money. I was saving for a train ticket to anywhere but there. Amos knew about it. He wanted it. That's the fortune I stole." Eli reached out in the dark, finding her cold hand and pressing it flat against his chest, right over his heart. "If they want you," he said, his voice low and hard as iron, "they have to take me too." Asterisk, she didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed him fierce, desperate, and alive, and he answered in kind. In that broken barn, with nothing but the wind for company, what passed between them wasn't payment for safety. It was a claim on hope. In the flickering light of a small fire they built against the cold, They finally learned how to give to one another without taking a thing dot when morning broke. They didn't run. They chose to fight. They rode back into Lander, but this time they moved with purpose. Eli left Clara safe at the boarding house and went hunting for the truth. He found the barkeep, a man who talked freely when coin was on the table. He confirmed that Amos had been buying rounds for the whole house right after. Silas's burial awfully generous for a man grieving a deck-ridden brother. Next, Eli tracked down Peterson near the old homestead. The neighbor whispered that he'd seen Amos hauling off a cradle and hand-stitched quilts, calling it settling the debt. Armed with this, Eli climbed the stairs to Judge Miller's office. Miller was a Union veteran with iron in his spine and no patience for fools. He listened to Eli, weighing the man in front of him against the rumors swirling in the street. He saw the soldier in Eli, the honesty, and he agreed to hear the matter before trouble turned deadly. "Bring her tomorrow," Miller said. "We'll set this right." Eli returned to the boarding house, and they took a room to wait. The town watched them, whispers trailing in their wake like dust. But that same morning, life interrupted their waiting. Down the hall, the blacksmith's young daughter went into early labor. The screams were sharp, and the doctor was miles away on a house call. While the other women in the hallway wrung their hands, Clara didn't hesitate. She rolled up her sleeves and went into the room. For hours, she worked with a calm focus, her own fears set aside for the sake of another. When a baby's cry finally pierced the air sharp and knew the hallway fell silent, Clara stepped out, wiping her hands, tired but triumphant. The women who had looked at her with suspicion just hours before now looked at her with different eyes. They saw strength where they had only seen scandal, but they never made it to the judge the next day. The sound of heavy boots pounding on the stairs shattered the afternoon peace. The door to their room crashed open, splintering against the wall. Amos filled the frame, red-faced with whiskey and hate, 2 hired guns standing at his shoulders like shadows. "You are coming with me," Amos snarled, his eyes fixed on Clara. "She is not," Eli said, stepping forward. He placed his body between the men and the woman he loved, a living shield. Violence erupted in a heartbeat. A knife flashed in the dim light. In the tight confines of the hallway, there was no room to draw. Cleanly, Eli knocked one strike aside with the heavy barrel of his pistol, the metal ringing out, but he couldn't stop the second man. A blade drove under his ribs, deep and vicious. Heat bloomed in his side, stealing his breath. He staggered back. Clara screamed, a sound that tore through the building. The gun fell from Eli's grip, clattering to the floor by her bare feet. One of the hired men raised his pistol, aiming squarely at Eli's heaving chest. There was no time to think, no time to beg. Clara dove. She grabbed Eli's fallen colt with both hands, her arms shaking uncontrollably, and pulled the trigger. The blast thundered in the narrow hall, deafening and final. The hired man reeled back, howling in pain, clutching a shoulder that was suddenly ruined red. He crashed into the wall and slid down, the fight draining out of him along with his blood. Eli collapsed. He slid down the wall opposite, his hand clamped tight over the wound in his side, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. Clara dropped the gun. It hit the floor with a heavy thud and fell to her knees beside him. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands slick with his blood. "Eli, stay with me," she cried, her voice cracking. "Please do not leave me." Shouts erupted from the street below. Moments later, Sheriff Brody and Judge Miller appeared at the top of the stairs, breathless. The judge took in the scene, the wounded gunman, Amos frozen in drunken shock, and Clara weeping over Eli, and his voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "Enough," Miller shouted. "Sheriff, Arrest Amos Jensen and these men. Assault and intimidation. Get them out of here. Clara didn't hear them. The commotion, the arrests, the shouting, it was all miles away. Her world had shrunk down to the terrible. Weight of Eli's head in her lap, and the slow, frightening warmth spreading over her hands. His eyes fluttered, unfocused. She pressed her forehead against his, her tears mixing with the sweat on his brow. "Stay," she whispered, a desperate prayer. "Stay. Wait, before we move on to the end of the story, what do you think about what just happened? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know if you saw that coming. Eli did not die that night. The knife had gone deep, dangerously close to ending him. But by some grace, or perhaps just sheer stubbornness, it missed his lung. The doctor, who arrived late and smelling of horse sweat, said it was the kind of wound that would have killed a weaker man. But Eli Walker wasn't weak. He spent the next weeks in a bed at the boarding house, drifting in a haze of pain and fever dreams. And through it all, Clara was his anchor. She never left his side. She changed his bandages with gentle hands, cooled his burning skin with damp cloths, and read to him from an old book of poetry the judge had lent them when the fever spiked. And he woke in the dead of night, shaking and calling out names from a war long past. She was there. She would whisper softly, her voice a lifeline pulling him back to the present. "You're not there," she'd say, smoothing the hair back from his damp forehead. "You're here with me. The war is over, Eli. You're safe." Her words worked better than the doctor's laudanum. His breathing would slow, his clenched fists would relax, and he would drift back into a restful sleep. It was the first time in years his nightmares had been met with kindness instead of empty silence. When he was finally strong enough to stand, she helped him to the window. He leaned heavily on the sill, looking down at the street. The town outside was changing. Folks who had once whispered about the widow Jensen now nodded respectfully as she passed on her errands. Word of her courage had spread like wildfire. She wasn't just a scandal anymore. She was the woman who had delivered the blacksmith's child when no one else could. She was the woman who had faced down armed men to save her wounded cowboy. Even Sheriff Brody, his face red with a mix of guilt and embarrassment, tipped his hat when he saw her in the market. Judge Miller had cleared her name publicly, declaring in the town square that Amos Jensen and his hired thugs were bound for prison. Clara's truth, once buried under layers of shame and lies, now stood open in the daylight. But as Eli watched her walk down the street below, he knew that none of that mattered to her. Not really. What mattered was the man standing at the window, the one who had stood for her when no one else would. One afternoon, the sunlight fell through the boarding house window like a benediction, turning the dust motes into floating gold. Eli stood beside her, his hand heavy on her shoulder for balance. He was still weak, but the color had returned to his face. "The charges are gone," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Amos will pay for what he did. You're free. Now, Clara." She smiled, but as she looked at him, there was a softness in her eyes that made his chest ache. "You say that like it doesn't include you," she whispered. He turned toward her fully, his weathered face open and vulnerable in a way it had never been before. "I've got nothing to offer you," he said, the words difficult to get out. "Just an old cabin upriver and a heart that's been patched together more times than I can count." Clara shook her head slowly. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "You've already given me everything," she said. "You gave me back myself." He reached for her then, his movements slow and unsure, like a man afraid to touch something holy. "I want to wake up beside you every morning," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you'll have me." She pressed her palm to his cheek, smiling through her tears. Only if you'll have a woman with too many ghosts. He kissed her there in the golden light of the late afternoon. It wasn't the kiss of rescue, or desperation, or survival. It was quiet. It was full of truth. It was a promise of peace. A week later, they stood beneath the wide, spreading branches of a cottonwood tree by the Wind River, the same river that had tried to take her life just weeks before. Judge Miller stood before them, reading the vows from a small black book. The blacksmith and his wife stood as witnesses, their newborn son sleeping soundly in his mother's arms. Clara wore a blue dress she had sewn herself, the fabric the exact color of the morning sky. Eli's old army shirt was clean and pressed, beneath his best vest. When the judge declared them husband and wife, Clara lifted her face to the sun and asked the question that had once carried all her fear. "Will you stay now?" Eli smiled, pulling her close. His voice was steady as the mountains behind him. "I've been staying since the night I found you." They returned to the river, but they didn't go back to the old way of living. They built a new home together, a small white cabin on a rise above the water, safe from the floods. Eli built the porch wide, just so she could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset burn gold over the peak's dot. She filled the windows with flower boxes and the rooms with a laughter that had been missing from both their lives for too long. The people of Lander came to respect them deeply. Some still whispered. Of course, small towns always have their gossips, but whispers can't live where work and kindness grow. Clara became the woman the town called on when a child was due or a heart was broken. She had a way of listening that made people feel heard. Eli mended fences, helped neighbors rebuild barns after summer storms, and always kept the coffee hot for anyone who rode up his trail. Years rolled on, marking time not by tragedies, but by the quiet turning of the seasons. They were gentle years, full of hard work and the kind of satisfaction that comes from building a life with your own hands. But they didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. They still carried their scars, Eli's from the war and the knife, Clara's from a life that had tried to break her. The difference was, they no longer carried the weight alone. They shared the load, balancing it between them, so it never became too heavy for one set of shoulders to bear. There were still nights, particularly when winter set in and the wind howled down from the high pines like a banshee, that the darkness felt dangerous. Clara would wake to find Eli sitting up in bed, his body rigid, staring into the shadows. His eyes would be wide and haunted, seeing the smoke of battlefields or the faces of men he couldn't save. She wouldn't startle him. She would simply reach out, taking his rough, scarred hand in hers, anchoring him back to the earth. "You're not there," she would whisper, her voice cutting through the noise of the memories. "You're here. You're home." And slowly, the tension would leave his frame. He would squeeze her hand, take a deep, shuddering breath, and lie back down. The ghosts would retreat, chased away by the simple reality of her presence. One evening, as the sun began to drop behind the western hills, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, they saddled the horses. They rode side by side along the river flats, the air cooling rapidly as twilight approached. The smell of sagebrush and damp earth rose up around them. The Wind River ran clear that evening. It was calm and steady, lazily winding its way through the valley. It looked nothing like the brown, angry monster that had roared through the canyon years ago, chewing up trees and threatening to swallow Clara whole. It was just a river now, part of the land, part of their life, but no longer their master dot. As their horses walked in step, Clara reached across the small distance between them. She took his hand, and their fingers interlaced naturally, a gesture born of 1,000 days of partnership. Eli looked at her. Her hair had streaks of gray in it now, and the lines around her eyes or from squinting at the sun and smiling, not from fear. He looked at the woman who had saved him just as surely as he had saved her. For the first time in his long, hard life, he realized his heart felt completely light. There was no heavy stone of grief sitting in his chest. There was no waiting for the next blow to fall. They had come through fire and flood. They had survived shame, sorrow, and the cruelty of men. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and they were still standing. What remained between them was something far more durable than the fiery passion of a dime novel romance. It was a quiet, honest love. It was the kind of love that doesn't fade when the youth wears off or the sun goes down. It was the kind of love the wind remembers long after you're gone. And as they rode on into the deepening twilight, the river sang below them. It was a soft, steady rhythm, carrying away the meltwater of the mountains, carrying away the debris of the past, and carrying away everything that had once tried to drown them.